The first rule I learned about surviving a bad night in Manhattan is simple. If someone powerful looks at you like you belong in their world, run the other way. I didn't run, mostly because I didn't know who he was yet. The rain had started 20 minutes earlier, the kind that turned city lights into blurry halos and made every street smell like wet asphalt and exhaust. My sneakers slapped against the pavement as I cut through a narrow alley behind 52nd Street, my breath coming fast, my lungs burning like I'd just run a mile instead of a few blocks. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just nerves, just the echo of footsteps that might not even be following me. But every instinct I had screamed that someone was back there. The alley opened toward a quieter street, lined with dark townhouses and parked cars that glistened under yellow streetlights. I slowed for half a second, pressing one hand against the cold brick wall beside me, trying to steady my breathing. My name is Emily Carter, and until about 15 minutes earlier, my biggest problem that night had been a late subway and a broken umbrella. Then I turned the corner and almost collided with him. 1 second the street was empty. The next second there was a man standing directly in front of me like he had stepped out of the darkness itself. I stumbled, catching myself against his chest, the fabric of his suit cool and dry despite the rain. He didn't move. Not an inch. Most people would have stepped back, maybe said sorry, maybe looked annoyed. He just stood there, tall enough that I had to tilt my head to see his face, his posture perfectly still like the storm around us had nothing to do with him. For a second I thought he might be some Wall Street guy heading home late. Expensive suit. Clean lines. The faint scent of something sharp and expensive, like cedar and winter air. Then I looked at his eyes. Dark. Calm. The kind of calm that made the whole street feel suddenly quieter. Behind him, a black SUV idled at the curb with its headlights glowing through the rain. I didn't notice the men inside it yet. I didn't notice the way the driver was watching everything through the windshield. What I noticed was the sound of footsteps behind me again, closer this time. My heart dropped into my stomach. I glanced over my shoulder and saw two shapes emerging at the far end of the street, moving quickly under the streetlight. Maybe they weren't after me. Maybe they were just walking. But something inside me said otherwise. Panic does strange things to your brain. It makes seconds feel like hours. It makes terrible ideas feel like the only ideas you have. I turned back to the stranger in front of me, my mind racing through a dozen options that all ended badly. Then my survival instinct chose one for me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I reached up, grabbed the front of his suit jacket, and pulled him down just enough to close the distance. And I kissed him. Not gently, not romantically, just desperate enough to look real. For a split second the world froze. The rain, the footsteps, the sound of traffic somewhere far away. His body went perfectly still under my hands, like he was deciding something. Then I felt it, the subtle shift of his posture, the way his arm moved around my waist, steadying me as if this had been his idea all along. The footsteps behind us slowed. I didn't dare turn around yet. Instead I stayed there, pretending this stranger and I were exactly what we looked like in that moment. Two people who belonged together on a rainy Manhattan street. I had no idea that the man I had just kissed was Adrian Volkov. And in this city, that name had a way of changing everything. For a moment I forgot why I had done it. The rain kept falling around us, soft but steady, tapping against the black SUV and the quiet brownstones lining the street. His hand rested lightly at the small of my back, steadying me, not pulling me closer and not pushing me away. It felt deliberate, controlled, like every movement he made was chosen carefully. My heart was still racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. I forced myself to breathe slowly and finally pulled back just enough to glance over his shoulder. The two men who had been following me were standing under the streetlight about 30 feet away. They had stopped walking. One of them looked uncertain now, shifting his weight like someone who had suddenly stepped into a situation he did not understand. The other leaned slightly toward him and whispered something I could not hear. Then both of them looked directly at the man in front of me. Something changed in their expressions. It was subtle but unmistakable. The tension drained out of their posture almost immediately, replaced by something closer to caution. They were no longer watching me. They were watching him. I felt the stranger's chest rise slowly beneath my hands, calm and steady, while mine still felt like it might burst. He had not asked a single question. He had not pushed me away. He had simply allowed the moment to exist, as if he already understood more about the situation than I did. One of the men at the end of the street gave a quick nod toward us, the kind people give when they suddenly realize they have made a mistake. Then both of them turned and walked the other direction without another word. Just like that. No shouting. No confrontation. They simply left. I stayed frozen for another 2 seconds, making sure they were really gone before I slowly lowered my hands from the stranger's jacket. The rain felt colder now that I was not moving. I stepped back, suddenly aware that I had just kissed a man I had never seen before in my life. I opened my mouth to apologize, but the words stalled somewhere in my throat when I finally looked at him clearly. Up close, he looked even more composed than before. Dark hair brushed back neatly, rain sliding off the shoulders of a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His face held the kind of calm expression that made it difficult to read what he was thinking. But his eyes were focused entirely on me, studying me in a quiet way that made my pulse spike again for a completely different reason. Behind him, the rear door of the black SUV opened without a sound. I had not even noticed the driver before, but now a tall man in a dark coat stepped out and stood beside the vehicle, scanning the street with quiet attention. Another man shifted in the front passenger seat. Suddenly, the quiet street did not feel empty anymore. It felt organized, structured, like every person present already knew exactly where they were supposed to stand. Except me. The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to command attention. That was an interesting solution. I felt heat rush to my face despite the cold rain. I am so sorry. I just panicked. I thought those men were following me, and I did not know what else to do. He watched me for another moment, then glanced briefly toward the end of the street where the two figures had disappeared. When his eyes returned to mine, there was something faintly thoughtful in them now. They were following you, he said calmly. My stomach tightened. So I was not imagining it. Thank you, I said quickly. I really appreciate you helping me. I will not bother you anymore. I turned slightly, ready to hurry away before the embarrassment could get any worse. That was when he spoke again. Emily Carter. My name stopped me mid-step. I turned back slowly. He had not asked my name, yet he had said it like he had known it for years. The rain continued to fall quietly around us, while the man studied my reaction with patient interest. In Manhattan, there are millions of strangers you can run into on a rainy night. Somehow I had managed to run into the one man who already knew exactly who I was. For a second I wondered if I had misheard him. The rain kept falling in a steady rhythm against the pavement, and somewhere down the block a taxi rolled past with its tires hissing on wet asphalt. But everything around me suddenly felt very still. He had said my name with complete certainty. Not like a guess, not like a question, like a fact. My mind raced through every possibility I could think of. Had we met before? Had I served him coffee somewhere? Had he seen me at the bookstore where I worked 3 evenings a week? None of it made sense. I stared at him, trying to find some hint of recognition in his expression, but his face remained calm and unreadable. The man by the SUV shifted slightly, watching the street with quiet attention, and it finally hit me that this was not a normal situation. Nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. How do you know my name? I asked slowly. My voice sounded steadier than I actually felt. The stranger did not answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying me as if I had just confirmed something he already suspected. Rain traced a thin line down the side of his jaw, but he did not seem to notice it. Most people in Manhattan hurry when it rains. They duck under awnings or rush toward the nearest subway entrance. This man stood perfectly still, like the weather had no authority over him at all. Finally, he spoke again. You were leaving the Midtown train station 12 minutes ago, he said calmly. You turned down 49th Street, instead of heading toward the avenue. That was when those men started following you. My stomach tightened. Every detail he mentioned was correct. I remembered glancing over my shoulder outside the station entrance and seeing 2 figures step onto the sidewalk behind me. At the time, I had told myself it was nothing, just strangers heading the same direction. Apparently, it had not been nothing. I crossed my arms without thinking, partly to keep warm and partly to hide the sudden tension in my hands. That still does not explain how you know my name. A faint expression touched the corner of his mouth then. Not quite a smile. More like quiet amusement. Behind him, the man near the SUV opened an umbrella and held it over the rear door without saying a word. The stranger did not move toward it. He was still watching me. Emily Carter, 24 years old, he said evenly. You moved to Manhattan 3 years ago from Albany. You work mornings at a small bookstore on Lexington Avenue, and you attend evening design classes twice a week at Midtown Community College. Hearing my life summarized like that made a strange chill run through me that had nothing to do with the rain. I took a small step backward before I even realized I was doing it. "Who are you?" I asked. The question hung between us for a moment. The streetlight reflected off the wet pavement, casting a pale glow across the black SUV and the quiet row of brownstones. When he finally answered, his voice was calm in a way that made the night feel even more serious. "My name is Adrian Volkov." The name meant nothing to me at first. It sounded European, maybe Russian, maybe something else. But the moment he said it, the man beside the SUV straightened slightly, and the driver inside the vehicle glanced up in the mirror with quiet attention. The air around us shifted in a subtle way I could not explain. Adrian watched my reaction carefully, as if he expected recognition to appear on my face at any second. It did not. I simply stood there in the rain, trying to understand why a complete stranger knew so much about my life. After a moment he spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "You kissed me because you were trying to survive," he said. That was a very intelligent decision. I blinked in confusion. I did not feel intelligent right now. I felt like I had stepped into the middle of something I did not understand at all. "I think I should go home now," I said quietly. Adrian looked at the empty end of the street where the two men had disappeared earlier. Then he returned his gaze to me. "You could try," he said. "But the people who were following you tonight will still be looking for you tomorrow. And now they know exactly what you look like." The words settled into the cold night air and refused to leave. I stood there staring at him, trying to decide if he was exaggerating or if I had just walked into a situation far bigger than I understood. The rain continued to fall steadily, soaking through the sleeves of my jacket, but I barely noticed anymore. My mind kept replaying the last thing he said. "They will still be looking for you tomorrow." I shook my head slowly, trying to force logic back into the moment. "That does not make sense," I said. "I did not do anything. I left work, I took the train, and I walked home. People do not just start chasing someone for no reason." Adrian watched me carefully, the same calm expression still on his face. For a moment he did not answer. Instead he glanced down the quiet street again, as if confirming something only he could see. Then his attention returned to me. "People rarely understand the reason they become involved in something," he said evenly. "Most of the time, they simply happen to be in the wrong place when something important happens nearby." I frowned slightly. "Nearby?" His gaze lingered on me, measuring my reaction. "Did you stop anywhere after leaving the train station?" he asked. I thought about it for a second. I stopped at a coffee stand on the corner of 49th and Lexington. It was closing, so I grabbed a cup to go. Adrian nodded once, almost like he had expected that answer. The man standing beside the SUV shifted his stance slightly, listening without interrupting. Adrian continued. "And while you were standing there, did you notice a black sedan parked on the opposite side of the street?" I tried to remember. The rain, the glow of streetlights, the reflection of headlights on wet pavement. Slowly an image surfaced in my mind. There had been a dark car parked near the curb, its windows tinted so heavily I could not see inside. I had not paid attention to it at the time. "Maybe," I said carefully. "I am not sure." Adrian studied my face for another quiet second. Then he spoke in the same calm tone as before. "The men who followed you tonight were watching that car. Not you." I blinked in confusion. That makes even less sense. Why would they follow me if they were watching a car? "Because," Adrian said quietly, "you walked past it at the exact moment they were waiting for someone to come out." The realization spread slowly through my chest like cold water. "You were saying they thought I was someone else." "Something close to that," he replied. I rubbed my forehead, trying to process the absurd chain of events. I accidentally walked past a random car, and suddenly two strangers start following me through Midtown? That cannot be real. Adrian tilted his head slightly. "It is real enough that they followed you for 3 blocks. The street went quiet again except for the sound of rain tapping against the SUV. I glanced toward the empty end of the street where the two men had disappeared earlier. My stomach twisted. What if they figure out they made a mistake? I asked. Adrian did not hesitate. They probably already know. That answer did not make me feel better. Then why would they still look for me tomorrow? I asked. Adrian stepped a little closer then, not threatening, just enough that his voice carried clearly over the rain. Because now you have seen their faces. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. That had not even crossed my mind. I looked down the block again, imagining those two figures turning around somewhere in the city and realizing the girl they followed had disappeared. My pulse quickened. I can just go home and forget about this, I said quietly. Adrian watched me for a long moment before speaking again. Emily, he said, his voice calm but certain. People involved in situations like this rarely forget loose ends. The rain continued to fall between us while that sentence settled into the space, like a quiet warning. I stood there in the rain trying to convince myself that Adrian was exaggerating. New York was full of strange moments. People misunderstood things all the time. Maybe this was just another one of those situations that sounded dramatic for a few minutes, and then faded away once everyone went home. That explanation would have felt comforting if Adrian had looked even slightly uncertain. He did not. His expression remained calm, almost patient, like a man watching someone slowly realize a truth they had not wanted to see. The quiet street around us suddenly felt much larger and much emptier than it had a few minutes earlier. I crossed my arms again, more from unease than from the cold. So what are you saying? I asked. That I am supposed to hide for the rest of my life because I walked past the wrong car? Adrian shook his head slightly. No, he said. I am saying the situation changed the moment you kissed me. I blinked in surprise. That was not the direction I expected this conversation to go. I only did that so they would leave, I said quickly. It was not supposed to mean anything. Adrian nodded once, like he completely understood. I know. But from their perspective, it means something very specific. I stared at him, waiting for the explanation. He gestured lightly toward the SUV behind him. The man holding the umbrella stepped closer, positioning it so the rain no longer fell directly on Adrian. Adrian continued speaking in the same calm tone. Those men were watching a vehicle connected to someone important. When they followed you and then saw you with me, they drew a conclusion. My stomach tightened again. What kind of conclusion? Adrian looked directly into my eyes. That you are under my protection. The words landed heavier than I expected. Protection. I repeated the word quietly, as if saying it might help me understand it. Yes, Adrian said. And in the circles those men move in, that changes everything. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. I did not ask for that protection. No, Adrian agreed calmly. But you created the appearance of it. I thought back to the moment in the alley when I grabbed his jacket and kissed him without thinking. At the time it had felt like a desperate trick to scare two strangers away. Now it sounded like I had accidentally signed some kind of invisible contract. This is ridiculous, I said softly. I do not even know you. Adrian watched me carefully for a moment, then spoke again. That part is easy to fix. My name is Adrian Volkov, he repeated quietly. The name still did not mean anything to me, but the way the men around him moved suggested it probably meant something to everyone else in this city. I hesitated before asking the next question. And what exactly does someone named Adrian Volkov do? For the first time since we met, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The kind of smile that did not quite reach his eyes. I manage certain things in this city, he said. Businesses. Logistics. People. The vague answer did not make me feel better. In fact, it made me feel worse. I glanced again toward the empty end of the street, imagining those two men somewhere out there trying to figure out who I was. Then I looked back at Adrian. So what happens now? I asked quietly. Adrian did not hesitate. Now, he said calmly, you get out of the rain and into that car. I stared at the SUV behind him. The rear door was already open. The interior lights cast a soft glow onto the wet pavement. I hesitated. I am not getting into a stranger's car in the middle of the night. Adrian nodded slightly, like he had expected that answer. That is a reasonable concern, he said. But tonight your options are limited. He stepped aside slightly and gestured toward the open door. You can walk home alone and hope those men decide you are not worth finding again. Or you can accept my protection until the situation settles down. The rain continued to fall around us while I stood there trying to decide which option sounded less dangerous. I stared at the open door of the SUV while the rain continued to fall around us, the soft interior light spilling onto the wet pavement like an invitation I had never planned to receive. My brain kept telling me that every safety rule I had ever learned was screaming the same warning. Do not get into a car with a stranger. Do not trust someone you just met in a dark street. Do not follow someone whose life you do not understand. But the problem was that the alternative Adrian had just described did not feel much safer. I glanced down the empty street again, half expecting the two men from earlier to appear at the corner, but the block remained quiet except for the distant sound of traffic somewhere in Midtown. When I looked back at Adrian, he was still watching me patiently, not rushing me, not pushing me, simply waiting for me to make the decision myself. That calm confidence made the moment feel even more serious. If he had been impatient or aggressive, I would have walked away immediately. Instead, he stood there as if he already knew what I was going to choose. I exhaled slowly and rubbed my damp hands together, trying to think clearly. How long would I have to stay under this so-called protection? I asked. Adrian answered without hesitation. Long enough for the situation to settle and for those men to realize they made the wrong assumption. That was not exactly a clear timeline. Hours, I asked quietly. Or days? Adrian considered the question for a moment. Probably not days, he said. But tonight would be unwise to spend alone. I hesitated again. The city around us suddenly felt very large and very complicated. A few hours earlier, I had been worried about homework assignments and an early shift at the bookstore. Now I was standing in the rain with a man who seemed to know far too much about my life and who spoke about danger as calmly as someone discussing the weather. Finally, I looked directly at him. You promise I can leave once this settles down? Adrian held my gaze for a moment before nodding once. Of course. That simple answer sounded sincere, but there was something in his expression that made me wonder if the situation was already more complicated than either of us had explained. Still, the rain was getting heavier, and the street felt colder with every minute. I glanced again at the open car door. The interior looked quiet and warm compared to the empty sidewalk. I made my decision before I could overthink it again. Fine, I said quietly. Just for tonight. Adrian stepped aside slightly, giving me space to approach the vehicle. The man holding the umbrella moved smoothly with him, keeping the rain from falling directly on the open door. I walked toward the SUV, my sneakers splashing lightly through shallow puddles on the pavement. Up close, the vehicle looked even more expensive than I had first thought, the polished black surface reflecting the streetlights like glass. I paused for half a second before climbing inside. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean and subtle, like cedar wood. The seat was warm, a welcome change from the cold rain outside. I sat carefully, still trying to process how quickly my evening had changed. A moment later, Adrian stepped in after me, and the door closed softly behind him, shutting out the sound of the rain almost completely. The driver started the engine immediately, the vehicle pulling away from the curb with smooth precision. I watched the street through the tinted window as the quiet block began to slide past us. For the first time since leaving the train station, I realized I had no idea where we were going. I turned slightly toward Adrian. Where exactly are we going? I asked. Adrian looked out the window for a brief moment before answering. Somewhere safe, he said calmly. And for reasons you will understand soon. Emily, that place is no longer your apartment tonight. I watched the rain slide across the tinted window as the SUV moved through Manhattan like it belonged to the city in a way I never had. The engine was quiet, almost too smooth, and the noise of the outside world faded into a soft hum behind the glass. For the first minute, neither of us spoke. Adrian sat beside me with the same calm posture he had on the street, one arm resting lightly against the door while he watched the passing lights. I tried not to stare at him, but it was difficult not to notice how completely at ease he looked. Most people would have seemed tense after a strange encounter like the one we had just had. Adrian looked like this was just another ordinary part of his night. The driver guided the SUV through a series of turns, leaving the brighter Midtown blocks behind us. Neon signs and crowded sidewalks slowly gave way to quieter streets and taller residential buildings. I finally broke the silence. You still have not told me where we are going. Adrian glanced toward me briefly, then returned his gaze to the city outside. Somewhere private, he said calmly. Somewhere people know not to ask questions. That answer only created more questions. I folded my hands together in my lap, trying to keep my voice steady. You talk about these men like they are part of some organized group. Adrian nodded slightly. Because they are. My stomach tightened again. And you know them? I asked. Adrian turned his head just enough to look at me directly. In this city, most people in certain circles know each other, he said. The sentence sounded simple, but the way he said it made it feel heavier than it should have been. I studied his expression for a moment before asking the next question that had been sitting in my mind since he first introduced himself. Earlier you said those men assumed I was under your protection. Why would they think that mattered? Adrian was quiet for a second before answering. Because reputation travels faster than explanation. I frowned slightly. That sounded like a carefully chosen answer that avoided saying anything specific. The SUV slowed at a red light, and for a moment the glow from a street lamp illuminated the side of Adrian's face. I noticed a small scar near his eyebrow that I had not seen before. It was faint but visible, like a mark from a story he had never bothered to explain. People in certain circles know your name, do not they? I said slowly. Adrian did not deny it. The light turned green, and the car continued forward. Eventually, the city skyline outside the window began to change again. The buildings here were taller and quieter, their lobbies glowing softly behind glass doors. Expensive residential towers. The kind I had only ever seen from the outside. I shifted slightly in my seat. I cannot imagine this night getting any stranger, I admitted. Quietly. Adrian glanced toward me again. It probably will, he said. The driver turned into a private driveway that curved beneath a towering building of glass and steel. A uniformed attendant stepped forward immediately, already opening the gate before the SUV even came to a complete stop. That small detail made something click in my mind. These people knew the car. They knew who was inside it. I looked back at Adrian as the vehicle rolled into an underground entrance lit with soft white lights. You come here often, I said. Adrian answered in the same calm tone as always. I live here. The SUV slowed to a stop in a quiet parking area, and the driver stepped out to open the door. As the interior light returned, I realized something else that made my pulse quicken again. For the first time that night, I was stepping fully into Adrian Volkov's world. The moment I stepped out of the SUV, the quiet of the underground garage wrapped around me like a different world from the rainy streets above. The air smelled faintly of polished concrete and cool metal, and the bright white lights reflected across the sleek black vehicles parked in perfectly straight rows. I hesitated for half a second beside the open door, looking up at the tall ceiling as if I expected the city noise to follow us down here. It did not. Everything felt controlled, organized, almost too calm. Adrian stepped out beside me with the same steady composure he had shown all night. The driver closed the door behind us and moved the vehicle smoothly toward another section of the garage without needing instructions. That detail did not escape my attention. These people did not ask Adrian what to do. They already knew. I followed Adrian toward a private elevator at the far end of the garage, my footsteps echoing lightly on the smooth floor. The elevator doors opened before we even reached them, as if someone upstairs had been watching our arrival. Inside, the walls were polished steel that reflected the light in soft lines. Adrian stepped in first and pressed a single button near the top of the panel. There were no other floors listed. The doors closed quietly, and the elevator began to move upward with barely any sound. I folded my arms again, partly from the lingering chill of the rain and partly from the strange feeling of being carried deeper into a world I had not planned to enter. You live at the top of the building, I said quietly. Adrian nodded once. The elevator continued rising for several seconds before slowing to a stop. When the doors opened again, the space beyond looked less like an apartment hallway and more like the entrance to a private residence. Soft lighting glowed along the walls, and a long corridor led toward a set of wide glass doors. Through the glass, I could see the faint outline of the city skyline beyond. Adrian walked forward, and the doors opened automatically as we approached. I stepped inside behind him and stopped immediately. The space was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the far wall, revealing Manhattan spread out beneath us like a field of lights. The rain had softened into a thin mist now, turning the city into a glowing sea of reflections. The apartment itself looked more like a modern gallery than a place where someone actually lived. Clean lines, dark wood floors, low furniture arranged with careful precision. Nothing cluttered the space. Everything felt deliberate. I walked a few steps farther into the room, trying to process the contrast between this quiet height and the crowded sidewalks I had been standing on less than an hour earlier. You were not exaggerating when you said somewhere private, I murmured. Adrian removed his jacket and set it neatly across the back of a chair before turning toward me. Privacy is valuable in this city, he said calmly. I slowly turned in a full circle, taking in the entire view. My small apartment across town suddenly felt like a distant memory. I faced Adrian again, still trying to understand the man whose world I had stepped into. Do many people come here? I asked. Adrian looked toward the glowing skyline for a moment before answering. Very few. That answer made the quiet apartment feel even larger. For reasons I could not fully explain yet, I had the strange sense that tonight I had crossed a line that was not easy to walk back across. I remained standing near the center of the living room while the city lights shimmered through the tall glass windows. From this height, Manhattan looked calm, almost peaceful, nothing like the restless streets I knew so well. The rain had softened into a silver mist drifting across the skyline, turning every building into a glowing reflection. I had lived in this city for 3 years and never once seen it from a place like this. Adrian moved quietly across the room toward a sleek kitchen area that blended into the rest of the apartment as if it were part of the architecture rather than a separate space. His movements were unhurried and precise, the same quiet control he had shown since the moment I ran into him outside. Without asking, he opened a cabinet and took out 2 glasses, then filled one with water and brought it toward me. "You should drink something," he said calmly. "You have had an unusual evening." I accepted the glass, realizing only then how dry my throat felt. "Thank you." The water was cold and clear, grounding in a way that helped slow the chaos still running through my thoughts. I set the glass down on a nearby table and looked at him again. I am still trying to understand how this became my evening. Adrian leaned lightly against the edge of the counter, studying me with the same thoughtful expression. "Sometimes events move quickly when different worlds intersect," he said. I let out a quiet breath. That sounded like the kind of answer someone gave when they did not want to explain the full story yet. I walked slowly toward the windows, stopping a few feet away from the glass. From here the streets looked like narrow rivers of headlights weaving between buildings. Somewhere down there was my small apartment, my normal life, the place I had expected to be tonight. I wrapped my arms loosely around myself and turned back toward Adrian. "Earlier you said very few people come here," I said. "Why bring me then?" Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because tonight you are safer here than anywhere else." The words were simple, but the certainty behind them made me pause. I studied him more carefully now, trying to understand the man whose name seemed to carry weight in circles I had never seen. Adrian did not look like the dangerous figure my imagination wanted to create. He looked composed, thoughtful, almost restrained. That made the mystery around him even more unsettling. "You keep talking about safety like you are responsible for it," I said slowly. Adrian met my gaze. "Tonight I am." I hesitated before asking the question that had been forming in my mind since the car ride. "And tomorrow?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked a few steps closer to the window and looked out across the glowing skyline beside me. The reflection of the city lights softened his expression for a moment before he finally spoke. "Tomorrow depends on whether the people who followed you tonight decide to forget what they saw." I followed his gaze out toward the endless lights of Manhattan. The idea that strangers somewhere in that vast city might still be thinking about me felt strange and distant, yet impossible to ignore. I turned slightly toward him again. "And if they do not forget?" Adrian's voice remained calm. "Then tonight will not be the only night you stay here." The quiet certainty in that sentence made the enormous apartment feel smaller all of a sudden, as if the line between my world and his had already begun to disappear. For a while neither of us spoke. The city lights continued to shimmer beyond the glass, and the soft hum of the building filled the silence between us. I rested my hands on the edge of the window frame, trying to steady the strange mix of curiosity and unease that had been building since the moment I stepped into Adrian's world. Everything about this place felt distant from the life I knew. The quiet, the height, the feeling that nothing here happened by accident. Adrian finally moved away from the window and walked toward a hallway that curved along the side of the apartment. "There are guest rooms down there," he said calmly. "You can use whichever one you like tonight." I turned toward him, surprised by how normal that sounded compared to everything else that had happened. "You plan for unexpected guests?" I asked. Adrian paused for a moment before answering. "I plan for many possibilities." The answer carried the same careful tone he had used all evening. I followed him a few steps down the hallway, noticing how the lighting softened as we moved farther from the living room. The space here felt warmer, less like a gallery and more like a place someone might actually sleep. Several doors lined the corridor, each one simple and modern, the kind that closed quietly without a sound. Adrian opened the nearest one and stepped aside so I could look inside. The room was larger than my entire apartment living room. A wide bed stood against the far wall, covered with clean white sheets. A reading lamp glowed softly beside it, and another set of windows revealed a different view of the city stretching toward the river. "You can stay here," Adrian said. I stepped inside slowly, still trying to understand how a night that began with rain and a subway ride had brought me to a place like this. "Thank you," I said quietly. Adrian remained near the doorway, watching with the same calm focus that made it difficult to guess what he was thinking. "If you need anything," he said, "there is a phone on the table. Someone will answer at any hour." That sentence made me glance back at him. Someone. Not a receptionist. Not security. Just someone. The way he said it suggested that his world operated on a completely different set of rules. I nodded slowly. "I think I will be fine." Adrian studied me for a moment longer before giving a slight nod of his own. Then he turned and walked back toward the living room, leaving the door open behind him. I stood there in the quiet guest room, listening to the faint sounds of the apartment beyond the hallway. For the first time since leaving the train station, everything had finally slowed down enough for me to think clearly. I walked over to the window and looked out across the dark river reflecting the lights of the city. Somewhere out there were the streets where my ordinary life still existed. My job at the bookstore. My small apartment. My classes. Yet tonight I was standing in the home of a man whose name seemed to carry weight in places I had never imagined. I rested one hand lightly against the cool glass and tried to make sense of the strange chain of events that had led me here. Adrian Volkov had said this situation might end tomorrow, but something deep inside me whispered that the moment I stepped into this apartment, my life had already changed in ways neither of us fully understood yet. I did not sleep right away. The guest room was quiet and warm, the bed soft enough that it felt unfamiliar, but my mind refused to slow down. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment, listening to the faint sound of the city somewhere far below the glass windows. Every few minutes headlights moved across the river like slow drifting stars, reminding me that Manhattan never truly rested. Eventually I stood and walked back toward the hallway, unsure why I suddenly felt the need to move. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange awareness that the night was not finished yet. The apartment remained quiet as I stepped into the corridor. A soft glow from the living room spilled across the floor, and when I reached the corner, I saw Adrian standing near the tall windows again. He had changed out of his jacket and rolled the sleeves of his white shirt just slightly, revealing a more relaxed version of the composed man I had met in the rain. He held a phone in one hand, speaking quietly in a language I did not recognize. His voice was calm but precise, the tone of someone giving instructions that did not need to be repeated. I stopped before he noticed me, not wanting to interrupt. After a moment, he ended the call and lowered the phone. That was when he glanced toward the hallway and saw me standing there. "I did not mean to listen," I said quickly. Adrian shook his head slightly. "You were not listening long enough to hear anything important." That answer made me smile faintly despite the tension still lingering in the room. I stepped closer to the windows beside him and looked out at the city again. It was strange how peaceful everything appeared from this height. "I thought you said the guest room was for sleeping," I said quietly. Adrian looked at me for a moment. "I also said tonight was unusual." "Fair point." I rested my hands lightly against the cool glass and watched the river reflect the lights of the bridges stretching across it. A few seconds passed before Adrian spoke again. "The men who followed you earlier were identified." I turned my head toward him immediately. That was fast. Adrian's expression remained calm. "Information moves quickly in certain circles." I studied his face, searching for any sign of worry or tension, but there was none. "And?" I asked. Adrian considered his answer for a moment. "They already understand that you are not the person they expected." Relief moved through me so quickly that I almost laughed. So the whole thing really was a misunderstanding. Adrian nodded slowly, but there was still something thoughtful behind his eyes. Mostly. Mostly was not a word that inspired confidence. I crossed my arms lightly and leaned back against the window frame. "What does mostly mean?" Adrian turned slightly toward the city again before answering. "It means they now know who you were standing with instead." I felt my stomach tighten again. "And that changes things." Adrian met my gaze again, his voice steady as always. "It means they will not bother you again." That sounded reassuring, but something about the quiet certainty in his tone made me pause. "Why do I feel like that sentence has a second meaning?" I said softly. Adrian did not deny it. Instead, he gave the faintest hint of a smile. Because tonight they saw you with me, Emily. And in their world, that makes you part of a story they will not forget anytime soon. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the building and the distant pulse of the city below us. Adrian's words lingered in the air like a truth I had not fully decided how to accept yet. I looked back out at the skyline, trying to see Manhattan the way he must see it. From this height, the city looked smaller, almost manageable, like a map of glowing lines and quiet patterns. But I knew that down there millions of lives were moving through their own stories at this exact moment. Somewhere among them were the men who had followed me earlier, and now apparently they knew a new detail about my life. I exhaled slowly. I still cannot believe a single moment on the sidewalk created all of this, I said quietly. Adrian remained beside me at the window, his posture relaxed but attentive. Small moments often change larger stories, he said. I turned toward him, studying the calm certainty in his expression. It still amazes me how calm you are about all of this. Adrian gave a faint smile. From my perspective tonight is relatively quiet. I laughed softly despite myself. That sentence told me more about his world than any direct explanation could have. I walked a few steps away from the window and leaned lightly against the back of one of the chairs, letting my mind catch up with everything that had happened. So the men from earlier know they followed the wrong person, I said. Adrian nodded. Yes, and they know you were with me. Another nod. That is correct. I folded my arms again, thinking through the situation carefully. And that means they will stay away from me. Adrian looked at me with a thoughtful expression before answering. They will stay away from anything connected to me. That clarification made the room feel slightly quieter. For the first time I realized that the strange sense of safety in this apartment was not coming from locked doors or security cameras. It was coming from Adrian himself. I glanced back toward the hallway leading to the guest room. I should probably try to sleep if tomorrow is supposed to be normal again, I said. Adrian watched me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Tomorrow will be simpler than tonight. I smiled faintly. That is a very low standard. Adrian's expression softened slightly at that. As I turned to walk back toward the hallway, I paused halfway across the living room and looked over my shoulder at him. Adrian was still standing near the window, the lights of Manhattan reflecting faintly across the glass behind him. There was something about that image that made the entire night feel strangely unreal. Thank you for helping me tonight, I said quietly. Adrian met my gaze across the room. You helped yourself first, Emily. I frowned slightly. How? He gave the smallest hint of a smile again. You chose to survive. I thought back to the moment in the rain when panic had pushed me to grab his jacket and pull him close. At the time it had felt reckless and desperate. Now it felt like the exact decision that had changed everything. I nodded once and turned back toward the hallway. As I reached the guest room door, I paused again, one last question forming in my mind. Adrian, I said softly. He looked up from the window. Yes. I hesitated before asking it. What would have happened if I had not kissed you tonight? Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering in the same calm voice he had used all evening. Then we would never have met, and for reasons neither of us fully understands. Yet, Emily, that might have been the greater loss. The apartment grew quiet again after I disappeared into the guest room, but sleep still did not come easily. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling while the events of the night replayed in slow motion through my mind. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, and the city lights beyond the window now looked sharper, clearer, like the storm had simply wiped the sky clean. Eventually exhaustion won. The next thing I knew, pale morning light was spilling through the tall glass windows. For a moment I forgot where I was. The room was too large, the ceiling too high, the quiet too complete. Then the memory of the night returned all at once, and I sat up slowly, realizing I had just spent the night in Adrian Volkov's home. I got dressed and stepped back into the hallway, half expecting the apartment to still be silent. Instead I smelled coffee. The scent drifted from the kitchen area near the living room. When I walked out of the corridor, Adrian was already there, standing beside the counter with a cup in his hand while the morning sun stretched across the skyline behind him. The city looked completely different in daylight. Ferries moved across the river, traffic flowed along the bridges, and Manhattan had returned to its usual rhythm. Adrian glanced toward me as I approached. Good morning, Emily. His tone sounded as calm as it had the night before, as if this strange situation had already become normal. Good morning, I replied. I accepted the coffee he offered and walked toward the window, studying the familiar city from this unfamiliar height. Everything looked so ordinary now that it almost made the night feel imaginary. I turned back toward him after a moment. So what happens now? Adrian set his cup down on the counter and stepped closer to the window beside me. The situation from last night has already been resolved, he said. The men who followed you will not return. Relief passed through me again, lighter this time. That means I can go back to my normal life. Adrian nodded slowly. Yes. The elevator will take you directly to the street when you are ready. I watched the movement of cars far below for a moment before finishing the coffee. A quiet part of me felt strangely disappointed that the night was ending so simply. I placed the cup back on the counter and picked up my bag. Thank you again for everything, I said. Adrian walked with me toward the elevator near the entrance of the apartment. When the doors opened, the hallway lights reflected softly against the steel walls just like they had the night before. I stepped inside and turned back toward him one last time. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Adrian said quietly, Emily. I paused. Yes. If you ever find yourself in danger again, you know where to find me. The elevator doors began to close before I could answer. A few seconds later, I was descending back toward the ordinary world I knew. When the doors opened in the lobby, the morning air of Manhattan rushed in through the entrance doors. I stepped outside onto the busy sidewalk, blending back into the flow of people heading to work, taxis passing, and coffee cups in hurried hands. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Yet as I walked toward the subway station, one thought remained quietly in the back of my mind. Sometimes survival changes more than the moment itself. Sometimes it changes the story you have not lived yet.